Capacity of the states to execute those projects in a manner that protects the interests of the states are questionable.
I think the fundamental challenge of our economy is that, first of all, the inequality is racialized and it's gendered, but ultimately you have the majority of the people in the country being economically excluded, and that leads to most economic participants, even businesses, not being integrated into the formal economy.
How do we build a township economy that's growing and that's transformative? And I think some of the measures that have been used in the past, like BEE, I also want us to touch on those measures. Have they worked in terms of creating a bigger black middle class and creating more jobs for our people? Hi everyone, welcome to the Youth Uncensored. We are joined by some very special guests. I'll start with Neo. Neo is the chairperson of the WITS Rethinking Economics for Africa, fellow student, as well as prominent and notable businessman, as well as president of the Black Business Council, Mr. Sandile Zungu. I'm very honored and feel privileged to be speaking to these people. So yeah, hopefully it's going to be a very good conversation. Some very interesting talking points. The main topic is just looking at the economic challenges in our country and looking at some of the solutions around those challenges. So without wasting more time, I think I'd just like to ask, and either of you can just respond just very quickly. What are the core challenges within our economy in our country? What is stopping us from, being a real powerhouse in the world and in Africa?
Okay, ladies first. So I think in general, I would characterize the fundamental problem with our economy, the thing that's causing the poverty, the inequality, but also leading to the slow growth. It's just economic exclusion. And under that, there are various things. So we inherited an economy from apartheid that was fundamentally exclusionary. And when you have a developing economy that's meant to be growing, you try to integrate as many people as possible into working class earning people that can be consumers, so businesses can grow. That's the fundamental idea of economic stimulation and growth. When you have the majority of the people in the country either being unemployed, working very precarious low wage jobs, being underskilled, or living in just abject poverty, that type of systematic economic exclusion is what leads to the economy not growing. And I think the fundamental challenge of our economy is that, first of all, the inequality is racialized and it's gendered, but ultimately you have the majority of the people in the country being economically excluded, and that leads to most economic participants, even businesses, not being integrated into the formal economy. And I think that's what I would characterize the diagnosis of what's happening in South Africa as in general.
Yeah, and as someone who's involved directly in sort of the economic activity in the country, what do you think is the core challenges? She's highlighted inequality as being one of the core issues. What do you think are something a bit different to that, or maybe exactly that?
Okay, firstly, I must thank you guys for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to be in a dialogue, especially with young people whose confidence, whose youthful energy. And to answer to your question, I agree with Neva that in part the issue of economic exclusion, inequality lies at the center of our economic woes.
Yeah.
The nature of the architecture of our economy, if you go back to colonial days, it was to serve the colonial masters and extract minerals by rail to the nearest harbor, by ship to England.
Yeah.
The usefulness of South Africans was to serve that purpose, to provide labor, to build mining towns that will be expandable once the minerals are extracted. Financial services developed from that, banks, which obviously serve that purpose. And the rest is history. I will even argue that some of subsequent developments, the development of our industry and services sector, were accidental to that historic mission to serve the colonial purpose. And apartheid will have served to include the Afrikaners into the frenzy, feeding frenzy. And the vast majority of Africans will then have been left to the margins. So that architecture continues. When we inherited South Africa and we created a democracy post 1994, we never interrupted that pattern. It was a huge mistake. And the whole spatial planning, African people live far from places of work. Continue, have never integrated that. And therefore the whole cycle of exclusion defines the relationship with the means of production. With Africans feeling they can offer labor. When you graduate, where am I gonna work? Simply because we don't have generations of wealth creators. So that fabric of exclusion continues today. I think further compounding that, still talking to the theme of exclusion, is the fact that what I'll call a jumbo psyche, where we celebrate things that are big. You earn respect in South Africa once you are the size of Anglo-American. There is this new tendency to parade those that are multi-billionaires. So everyone now wants to aspire to become a multi-billionaire, to be big. Yet economies that thrive are the ones where the middle tier of affluent people really are the creators of jobs. Where the small businesses are the ones that create employment. Are the ones that add to this beautiful mosaic of growth, because they contribute in small measure, but the sum total is that an economy then grows. So when you talk about exclusion, you talk about the exclusion of SME sector, with oligopolies in the financial services sector, oligopolies in the telecom sector, squeezing and starving the emergent players of oxygen and pushing them out of the center. Not because it's deliberate on their part, it's because that's the nature of the game. They are allowed to just dominate. And anyone who's a new entrant is starved of oxygen. So if you have to come up with a solution, it has to involve SME sector. It has to involve entrepreneurship among those who just want to contribute without one ever to become big players who are happy in the minimum space.
Definitely. I think I've captured you quite well. And when I know as well, I think that sort of leads to, we've spoken about inequality, and as well as the need to expand our economy for SMEs to be more inclusive of that. So I think our problems stem way before 94 and stem way before now. And the only time I think is a good reference to look at might be that period from 1994 to say, from that time, did we take on a policy level, was that a good policy approach? I think it was, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the one, I'm not sure if it was GEAR in 94 or not, where it took a more neoliberal approach.
1996.
Was it 96? From GEAR onwards, where it took a neoliberal approach of allowing the private sector to play a more role in driving economic activity, versus what we have now, the National Development Plan. So looking at those two sort of policy frameworks, which do you think, where do our problems stem from between the two? Were they good? where could we have improved in those two sort of like policies?
I think yeah, you've contextualized it quite well by terming it the neoliberal policy structure that we took. And it wasn't just allowing private sector to lead. You had like numerous things, especially not exactly in 96, but following the Mbeki presidency, we adopted a lot of very I would say more severe neoliberal policies, even in the context of what was happening at the time, because generally economies at that time were being very fiscally conservative, but we also had the issue of being Africans. We had the problem of the IMF structural readjustment policies and government being pushed towards very, very harsh neoliberal stances in a time when they probably should have taken different measures. They should have probably been more focused on trying to increase fiscal spending, for example, instead of implementing austerity. And I think from that point, the characterization of the economy, even when you go into the RDP project of the Mbeki era, we had growth during that period, but it wasn't the kind of growth a country of our size with our population that had just like opened its markets should have been experiencing. And it was because we first of all did not protect our own economy. We decided to like engage in very neoliberal trade, right? Because we were promised as the Bretton Woods project would say, that the more trade you engage in as a country, the more growth you should be expecting. And that's the dream that a lot of developing nations were sold. Some bought into it, some didn't. Some were fast to recover from it. They started off saying, you know, we're going to have these liberal trade policies, and after a while they were like, no, wait, we're having liberal trade policies, but we're trading on an unequal basis. We're trading with countries like China at the time, which can flood our markets, and the trade deficit that we have is actually harming our economy, and it's harming local industry. And in South Africa, I think the main problem that we had is we didn't even use the competitive advantage in sectors that we already did have. For example, a classic example everyone uses, the manufacturing sector. There were very niche sort of manufacturing sectors that created a lot of jobs in South Africa that were very prominent during apartheid, because of the fact that we underwent, well, the apartheid era underwent the economic exclusion from the global economy. So you had not just things like Sasol and Eskom and these major parastatals or like major corporations developing. You also had very small businesses, textile manufacturers, furniture manufacturers. A very good case study is the fact that you had a lot of people in the leather and shoe manufacturing sector who were making a very good living. And these are entrepreneurs, they're small business owners. They're not like these huge companies that we classically imagine when we imagine economic growth. We had those very local sectors which were growing. Agri-processing was growing. We had very, very good growth. And then we decided to stifle that by opening up our borders and saying we're going to do liberal trade as far as possible. And I think that's part of what stifled us. And then you have that, right? You have that poor trade policy, and at the very same time you have fiscal and monetary policy, which was also hindering growth because of how conservative it was. I think the fundamental problem with the transition government and also the two terms that the Mbeki administration had is that was the time when, as a country, we should have been taking risks, but it was a time when we acted most conservatively, and we sort of like, to put it in like casual terms, we fumbled the bag at the time when, as a country, the world was expecting us to take risks because we had just opened. We were open for business, as the slogan was.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's like a plane flying overhead, but we didn't capitalize on that, and it was on multiple fronts. It wasn't just the private sector leading the country, I think.
Yeah, and I low-key sort of like, in fact, high-key agree with you on that one. And when you compare it to sort of like in recent memory with the Zuma administration, and probably now as well, I think what I would say is that under President Zuma, I think the country did probably take more of a role in leading infrastructure developments by insourcing most of its the work that it did, which resulted in probably a bit more jobs inside the state, which probably leads to a lot of critics now. What they say is that the state is overemployed, and things like that. So how do we balance the two? As someone who was there, and if I'm not mistaken, you're also an economic advisor under the former president, and I'm not sure if it's even right now as well. But did we get it right with these two administrations, with Mbeki, like we've highlighted the shortcomings of that policy, as well as with the Zuma years in terms of leading infrastructure as a state? Where do we draw the balance between the two?
I think just to correct something, I never fulfilled any advisory role in the Zuma administration. At some stage, I was earmarked to be the Director General, but the timing was just bad from my side, and that never happened. If you go back to the issue of the GIS, what do they say? They say hindsight is perfect science. When we inherited a post-apartheid, South African economy, it was overborrowed. It had no leg room, no headspace. It was an insular economy. It was a pariah economy. There was a financial rand, there was a commercial rand to deal with it. So things that when you look back now, you would ignore. But they were a reality. We'll talk about inflation, maybe not super inflation, but certainly way outside of the current range. So South Africans were becoming poorer and poorer. And add to that the apartheid structure, social structure. The challenges were quite huge. And I can imagine that the president at the time, Mandela, and with the deputy president Mbeki, already assuming the role of a prime minister, would have said, "What then?" And there were lots of advisors from eminent institutions, whether it's Harvard or wherever, who were telling us about the promises of Bretton Woods institutions that now so eloquently spoke about, and the promises that we're making about open your trade, be open to foreign direct investment, all sorts of promises were made that if you do this, this is what's going to happen. But the truth is, what was promised didn't really happen. We're even persuaded allow Old Mutual to go and list in London. It's going to access capital, which can then deploy in South Africa. It never raised any capital. All the offshore fund projects were funded through policyholders' funds from South Africa. The same went for Anglo-American. Allow Anglo to go and list in London, where it can easily raise capital to invest in South Africa. I cannot think of any project that was funded from London by Anglo-American. What has actually happened instead is that it's unbundled, disposed of, and its shareholder base is predominantly now international. The same went for the likes of Genco, who sold its mining assets to Billiton, and then ultimately merged with the BHP, merged with Billiton to form BHP Billiton. Is now South 32. They're back to square one. So that experiment of externalizing some of our most treasured conglomerates was a failed experiment by all measures and standards. So we're duped as a country, if I were to be as strong as to use that. We're duped by Bretton Woods institutions with false promises. But was it incorrect to adopt a fiscal and monetary stance that actually was to prove very helpful following the financial crisis of 2008, when the whole world was contracting and we're not contracting as fast? Evidence was that we had pursued the right strategy. We built our reserves, we grew a much faster pace.
Yeah.
During that decade, leading up to 2008.
Yeah.
Maybe not as fast as we could have. And our reserves were good. Yes, part of our growth was fueled by the what I'll call the super cycle of heavy demand for mineral resources from China. That is now history. We now learn that maybe we could have been a lot more forthcoming.
Yeah.
And a lot more assertive in terms of what are our needs. Forget about what Bretton Woods institutions are telling us.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, if you juxtapose that era with the most recent era, you will notice that an infrastructure-led growth that the Zumayas attempted to pursue, which would have been conceptualized even before then, and a developmental state agenda with the state being at the center, and led in part by the example of China, wouldn't work with us because the capacity of the state was questionable. The capacity of the state to execute those projects in a manner that protects the interests of the states are questionable. There are specific examples. Medupi it's taken us far longer than we anticipated to build the power station. It's still not operating at the optimal level. Gusila power station, similarly. The cost overruns, massive. Who's going to pay for it? Is the taxpayer, South Africa. If you look at the rail projects within Transnet that were led by the private sector, we are carrying the shorter end of the stick. Why? Because we have no capacity to implement on these projects. So the capacity of the state, you must not underestimate it, because if you are to pursue a certain agenda, you have to rely on someone to execute. If that person is not fit for purpose, you will drown in your own tears. And that's the state that we're in right now, where we're saying, come up with a solution, but who is to execute? Is it the state? There's no capacity there.
Right now, we do have the vast majority of Black people in our country either struggling to find work, or if they do have small businesses that they're trying, it's just not working out. So we've highlighted the inequality gap. How do we best transform what I would like to call the township economy to be more inclusive and to grow, to produce jobs, meaningful jobs, by the way, not just subjecting sort of like Black people to being petrol attendants and McDonald's workers? How do we build a township economy that's growing and that's transformative? And I think some of the measures that have been used in the past, like BEE, I also want us to touch on those measures. Have they worked in terms of creating a bigger Black middle class and creating more jobs for our people? So I don't know, so I don't want to take that one.
I like the townships were obviously created to subjugate our people. It was not done with progress in mind. You know, over concentration, you know, poor infrastructure. The born frees don't remember that not until long ago, Soweto was dusty streets. The tarring of roads in Soweto is something of a post-1994 phenomenon. You know, I come from KZN. When I came to Soweto for the first time in 1977, there was smoke billowing through every roof. You know, but the point I'm making is, if we develop those townships, we can shame the architects of townships who will never have anticipated that something will emerge out of this. Think about it. If the post-apartheid governments, administrations have created how many RDP houses? 2 million? That's estimate, 2 million. And a typical RDP house, including the bulk infrastructure that goes with it, for roads, sewage, water, electrification. Each structure has got a pro rata share, including the top structure. Let's say it costs about 300,000 to come up with that.
Yeah.
So now you're talking about 600 billion rands. If it's 2 million houses, 600 billion rands that should have been created and systematically transferred to the hands of black people.
Yeah.
And that massive distribution, remember the RTP houses were created and given as a grant, not passed over. 600 billion rands worth of wealth has been created. Now, if you make those townships worthy living in, you bring small business, you bring manufacturing and industry into the periphery of townships or even within the townships. Imagine if those property values shoot through the roof, such that a typical tile house that was built as an RTP house in Orange Farm will suddenly be worth R1 million.
Yeah.
It's not impossible to think about it. And that is wealth in black hands that they can leverage on to send their kids to tertiary institutions or leverage on to buy merchandise if they want to be involved in retail and so on.
Yeah.
That is massive wealth creation.
Yeah.
It can be done. It's within our capacity to do so. So my view is that bring all those call centers into the township. A typical child who's gone through to Model C schools, who can command English to service 3G in America, or to service intercontinental hotels. You're making a booking, you don't know who you're talking to. The call center is in Soweto. Why must a Soweto-born child have to catch a taxi to go and work for a call center in Central when you could bring that call center into the township so they can save on transport? They can just walk
to the
and suddenly you'll have people saying, I want to buy a property next to that office park. Why? Because when my child reaches that age, she can just walk to the call center. And that stimulates the issues of supply and demand. So what I like about SME sector is that you begin to talk simple language that people understand. And the impact on economic growth becomes tangible. They can relate with it, rather than the jumbo economics where people talk about exchange controls, talk about commodity, whose prices are determined elsewhere. Simplify economics, and then that's how you're going to foster inclusivity. So I'm a firm believer in township economy, but don't talk about spaza shops only. Also bring industry. And there's no reason why in a township like Umlazi, from where I come from, a township of maybe slightly less than 1 million people, where you say, as a Teweri municipality, we're going to earmark 5 hectares of ground in this area and another 5 hectares of ground in the another area, and make sure that the roads leading to that are expanded, and make sure that there's high 3-phase electricity and that goes into that area, and then encourage engine. Say, engine, your Vaseline or petroleum jelly plant will be located at Umlazi. So the filling of drums that will then go to Unilever for value added and branding will come from that plant. It's not impossible. We've got the resources, we've got the thinking, which resides also. Unfortunately, if we're going to leave that to the councillors and the local municipality who think about the next tender for PPEs, and then will be preparing to appear in commissions, will be consumed by our own malfeasances and inefficiencies, and will not realize that just within eyesight lies a massive opportunity to transform our economies.
No, I agree fully.
I think, yeah, you raised amazing points, especially regarding what's required, because what's required to build the township economy, because there are multiple things that come into play, like the fundamental infrastructure issues. Like, you talk about townships as these deliberately underdeveloped places, that people were moved away from centers of economic activity, and then even in those places, any type of economic activity that would be viable and lift people out of poverty was killed because it was moved towards the economic hubs. But I think what you're saying about infrastructure development takes us back to the issue of the developmental state as well. I think we always think of the state needing more power. I think the state is sufficiently powerful. What we need is the centralization of power, because what happens when we depend on the councillors, like you were saying, when municipalities are in charge of like things that our economic development as a nation, like nationally, when we have councillors and like municipalities being solely in charge of that, I think there becomes a disconnect between the various levels of government, where national policy, this big macro national policy, this vision, your gear, your RDP, doesn't translate down to what's supposed to be grassroots economic development. And that's because power isn't centralized. I think part of neoliberal discourse is sort of like admonishing the idea that power be centralized in the government. We think that having power more spread out is more democratic, but what happens is that you have these parallel government structures that operate in parallel, where we think of municipalities as something that's meant to be small scale, that's only dealing with service delivery, but municipalities have a very important economic function they're supposed to serve. And I think there should be stronger directives from the national government in terms of policies that focus on what should be happening with municipalities. I know, especially with the rural and township economies, the issues that we see as social, like for example roads and like inaccessible water, electricity, issues that we see as fundamentally social, and they do cause a lot of human suffering. They also cause the economic stagnation that we see. Nothing can grow in the townships. All you have is the tuck shops and the spaza shops being able to develop, because in order for anyone to say, even the black business owners to say, look, I'm going to invest my money into the township economy, there needs to be state development around that. You need your infrastructure, you need people to be living in that area, to have a decent quality of life there. And I think the example you use about the RDPs is brilliant, because we had the government invest so much money, and it's still happening. We have these massive RDP projects and people preparing themselves for state capture inquiries, like you're saying, and a lot of money is being spent, but we don't see what happens, because first of all, there's a issue of where these RDP houses are being located, because you have a lot of places where you could have had people live closer to centers of economic activity, but the government couldn't do that because it's an issue of private property ownership. And even the property that's owned by municipalities, you have cities like the city of Cape Town, where they own land. They don't want to place black people there. They don't want to place poor black people there, because even as the state, they have this capitalistic profiteering mentality that when you have a large number of lower income black people moving to an area, the property values are going to drop. They're not thinking in the longer term vision of saying, we want these people to be closer to economic centers. We want the new areas that develop to not just be townships, because what's happening now is that townships self-perpetuate, right? And we have the springing up of informal settlements around economic hubs. And usually what the government tries to do is, instead of building where those people are located, especially in Gauteng, the Western Cape, around Johannesburg, Cape Town, KZN, around Durban, we try and move those people back to where we think black people should traditionally stay. And I think that's a fundamental problem of our developmental economics, that it's very high level policy stuff, but when it's time for government to take the risk of investing in building RDP houses on property that is already valuable, we don't even have to wait until there is, you know, the petroleum jelly factory that you're talking about that's going to make the older townships property values increase. There are new townships growing every day. and there are new informal settlements growing every day, and people aren't stupid. Like, citizens are all economic actors, and where they place themselves, that's generally the place where they think there are more economic opportunities. But we perpetuate, or the government perpetuates, apartheid spatial planning because they isolate people from centers of economic activity, and then that incentivizes private sector to keep developing in the way that they're developing, from everything in terms of like manufacturing to the financial sector. They're not willing to take a risk that government isn't willing to take. If government isn't willing to take a risk with their own land to say we're going to place people there, why would your Johnson & Johnson want to establish a factory in a township? It doesn't make sense. So I think when you talk about government-led growth, it's not just the issue of government spending more and spending more. We need clear directives that show that government is willing to bet on small business owners, government is willing to bet on poor people, and government is willing to bet on lower income South Africans.
This sort of ties into what I want us to wrap up on, which is this really, really big and controversial topic within the business space, where people talk about is the term which has been categorized politically as white monopoly capital, which a lot of people are saying, especially organizations like the EFF and even the ANC, I think as well, have said it's the fundamental reason as to why black people and black businesses are not sort of prospering, is because of this gatekeeping and this old system of old white men, if you like, who are in charge and who run the economy. Is that a myth? Is that a reality? If it is true, how best do we go about it from a state perspective as well as an independent business owner? How do you, as a Mr. Sandile Zungu, one person, take on this institution? And so I really want us to wrap up with that and touch on that issue. I don't know, would anyone like to take that one?
I'd just like to get in while this is on my mind, the white monopoly capital thing. I think white monopoly capital as a buzzword is not inherently wrong. It describes various things that do happen, but I think when you have political slogans, many things get lost in translation. Throughout this session, we've been talking about a fundamentally white dominated economy, so where there's a lot of white wealth. And white wealth doesn't just exist in your oligopolies, your monopolies. White wealth exists in the fact that white people have access to credit, white people are property owners, even where white people aren't the capitalists and they don't own the means of production, there's an elite white working class. We have that, and that's something that we inherited from colonialism and apartheid, as we've been discussing. And then you need to discuss that as something that's related to the monopolistic structure of the economy, but they're not the same thing. And I think when you say white monopoly and you try and like put, a white farmer's face on the idea of like monopolistic capital, you miss a lot of the things that we've been talking about now. You miss the issue that we've been discussing about the fact that there's capital flight outside of South Africa from our oligopolies. We have people that have grown because they were protected by the South African economy. You have these major conglomerates that have grown and they're our monopolies, and there's a lot of capital flight through them and them not reinvesting in the economy. When you look at that and you look at the fact that most of their investors and the shareholders aren't even based in South Africa, how do you describe that as solely white monopoly? You need to characterize that as part of this globalized capital class that we have, and it's something that isn't even people like to imagine your Johann Rupert's, as it's just characterized as like one man, your Oppenheimers. The capitalist class that we have right now is very diversified. You have the people that are investors being normal everyday people that just bought shares in a company. So there's so many conflicting interests when we talk about the international capital class. I don't think we should just limit it to thinking white business owner. Our primary problem of monopolization is an international one, and it's related to globalism. And it's important to acknowledge that, because if the EFF were to come into power tomorrow and they were try to implement their policies of wealth redistribution, it would be significantly hard to do that, because you're now dealing with the international economy. You have governments in the world that have tried to implement transformative policies of land redistribution and property redistribution and basic things like workers' rights not being able to, because there's a punitive international system in the global economy where when governments try to protect their working class people, their local economies from this international globalized economy and the national corporations, they're severely punished for that. And they're legally punished for that. So we need to note those things so that it doesn't become a simplistic conversation where we just imagine your 100 Ruperts and your Oppenheimers and those people. I think wealth in the 21st century, and we're going to like the 22nd century, is going to be far more complex than that. And our political rhetoric needs to be moving a bit faster.
Now has put it so well.
Yeah.
I agree with every word she uttered. And I will say, look, we have a tendency in South Africa to move from one slogan to another. And the most contemporary is an old slogan. This white monopoly capital is not new. It's just been almost like remixed.
Yeah.
It was a lingo during the the fight against apartheid, and it was the favored lingo by the Communist Party. But it's now being owned by those who are in some quarters may have been seen as protagonists on the catch of the state. Now, and they use it very well to drive a certain agenda. Just to show how poisonous our lexicon has become, and those who thought they need to counter that messaging, they now from the French Alps or maybe from the Swiss Alps came up with a lingo called 9 wasted years. We don't have time to waste debating vitriol.
Yeah.
That is not constructive. So I agree with that. We use with the narrative that says, it's gonna be lost in the translation.
Yeah.
It may have validity, but because it's gonna be lost in the translation, it's not helpful.
Yeah.
It's not gonna help us to transform our economy. And the fact of the matter is that our economy is dominated by oligopolies.
Yeah.
There's no one sector where there's a monopoly now. Maybe even in the energy power generation, Eskom was a monopoly. It's owned by the state. There are no private sector monopolies per se. There are oligopolies in the telecom space. You can see MTN, Vodacom, and Telecom is muscling in. They are the people who decide what's the cost of data.
Yeah.
Yes, ICASA is not allocating spectrum. Maybe that gives credence to them, saying supply and demand rules mean that we've got to respond.
Yeah.
But that's an oligopoly. If you look at the banks, the big four banks in particular, Nedbank, Absa, FNB, Standard Bank, and maybe add to that Capitec, and maybe to a lesser extent Investec, they basically control.
Yeah.
And the fees would be a function of how willing are they to let go and make it easy for people to access credit. But they're a dominant player.
Yeah.
If you look at logistics, you'll find the same. If you look at food retail, you'll find the same. Pick and Pay, Shoprite, Checkers, Woolworths,
Insurance, everything.
Yeah, exactly. So those oligopolies. Now you ask yourself, what will make us to say they are white monopoly? Whereas if you look at the nature and the leadership of banks, by and large, is black people now. If you look at the leadership of telecoms, it's by and large black people. Even the ownership, the PIC is a dominant shareholder in all of these institutions. And the PICs are amenable to influence by black bureaucrats. So what makes it, is it historical or it serves the interest?
Yeah.
I will argue that the limiting factor is precisely that we're now part of a globalized economy.
Yeah.
If you want to expropriate land without compensation, the person who responds is Pompeo in America. because AfriForum is going to lobby. And then you chicken out because the ramifications are quite, the repercussions are quite strong.
Yeah.
So, how do we respond against the hated white monopoly capital? It becomes a vexing question.
Yeah.
But that should be the focus of our attention rather than saying what counter slogan can you come up with.
Yeah.
Practically, we need to open the economy and use legislation, use the Competition Commission and the tribunal to cut the monopolies to size.
Yeah.
And the state has got that power. And that is not limited by Bretton Woods institutions. It's not limited by multilateral institutions, dictates.
Yeah.
But they must use that power. And to the large extent, you know, one will argue that we're led by people who are cowards, who are not prepared to use the power that they have at their disposal.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think for me, with the term white monopoly capital, and I think you guys both opened up parts of the conversation which I had not been sort of exposed to, and I fully agree in terms of it's deeper than just categorized as just white male, and that's the only issue. We have huge economic ramifications and other complex issues within our economy to reduce it to just white farmers or white bankers or anything like that. I think for me, where I do sympathize with the term is when it speaks to the wealth distribution, that largely wealth is in the hands of white people in our country. And it's sad to see when, if you just think of it in layman's terms, your ordinary garage worker, McDonald's worker, everyone, these remedial, low-cost forms of labor are all sort of like black people. So that's for me the only part where I'll be like sympathize and say, okay, I understand where the slogan comes from, but I definitely do agree we do need to look past sort of the slogans and have more meaningful conversations that will drive solutions. And just in really closing, I think we have probably just 1 more minute. I want to hear, maybe if it's a yes or no, but really, really short answer, just can we still rely on the state to drive meaningful change, or should we just or leave it to the hands of the private sector and individuals to, you know, champion their own interest and look out for their own well-being? Do you think we can still rely on political parties, you know, with corruption and everything, the country, with everything we've discussed? Who is going to bring about meaningful change and solutions to bring all of these things that we've sort of spoken about today?
I think that isn't even a question. Now more than ever, we probably need to be led by like a very well capacitated state, because state power is the only translation of people's power we're going to get in the South African economy. We talk about economic exclusion, right? And we talk about how it affects people, but we can also look at it through how it limits people's ability to act on the economy, where most South Africans are sort of like these menial economic actors. We make economic decisions, but they don't translate into anything massive. So our power, especially as Black people, goes to politics. That's where we have the advantage. And I think it's just unfortunate that the state which we continue to elect and that still has majority power hasn't used the fact that they have majority power. They're not acting like the strong political party that they should be, especially because of the legislative majority that they have, the fact that the executive in South Africa has so much power and so much control. So the translation of power from the people to the state has failed because of the cowardice that occurs within our leaders, the fact that they're not risk takers, where South Africans every 4 years will bet on the same government and the government isn't willing to take the necessary risks. But I don't think that should lead to us saying, okay, we just need to let private sector lead. We need a capacitated state and we need to fight for it. And there needs to be more political competition for that state capacity to increase. And I think maybe that's what we're going to see with the shifting political dynamics. There's currently like economic stagnation, but politically, I think there's a lot of change happening and it's promising.
I think very briefly, we need the state, we need the private sector, we need both with equal prominence, I would argue. Why do you need the private sector? Because the state is fiscally constrained right now. That's a reality.
Yeah.
Some of the infrastructure projects that it wants to spearhead as triggering economic growth will require capital.
Yeah.
A resource mobilization from the state is limited. So you've got to come up with a private sector capital. And that private sector capital will come on condition that there is meaningful participation of the private sector.
Yeah.
It does not help that you've got corruption. It doesn't help that you've got inefficiencies in the state, because that weakens the argument for a state-led recovery plan. It's not going to happen. So you need both parties.
I really appreciate both your time to come out and just like have a chat to us and join us on our platform. Hopefully you guys will be back soon. We'll be lots to discuss. There's always things to talk about in our country and the world. Really wishing you well, Neo, and anything that you do. Hopefully, the organization, your studies, everything. Sandile as well. Appreciate you taking the time. And thanks to everyone who watched this episode. Hopefully there's some meaningful content that
make sure that I'm also useful.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Sandile and Bonga. This has been like a really great conversation, especially for the amount of time we had.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Neo. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
I need to have Neo's number.